So welcome everybody to this TDEG seminar. You probably all know, but TDEG is a network and a forum that brings people and organizations together to support the role of urban trees through better collaboration in the planning, design, construction, management, and maintenance of our urban places. So for this seminar, I want to thank our partners who do actually represent a really strong cross-sector interest in the topic. We have the Arboricultural Association, the Institute of Chartered Foresters, the Institute of Highway Engineers, the Institution of Civil Engineers, the Landscape Institute, and the Town and Country Planning Association. So to get going on this seminar, let me introduce our chair for the day, Kieron Doick, Head of Urban Forest Research at Forest Research. And probably known to many of you, Kieron's undertaken extensive research in many aspects of the urban forest, especially the impacts of climate change, both on the built environment and also on the resilience of trees themselves. So he's very well placed to guide us through this important topic. Over to you, Kieron.
Thank you very much, Sue. Before we start, just want to thank all of the speakers for your time today. I'm really looking forward to your presentations. Thank you everybody for joining us for this session. I'm sure it's going to be a very interesting couple of hours talking about resilience, climate risk and urban trees. And I won't go into any more introduction on myself because you've not come here to listen to me. But what I will say is that in reflecting, getting ready for this afternoon, I was thinking back on an article I read just a couple of weeks ago, actually, called "Don't Buy These Flats." The article was centered around the London Borough of Tower Hamlets, and it was talking about temperatures inside apartments reaching 27 degrees C, in fact, even peaking at 33 degrees Celsius. You know, it's long been known that those sort of temperatures indoors, temperatures 25 plus, in fact, can actually have a negative impact on health, especially for those with existing cardiovascular conditions. And even for those without conditions, you know, it impacts people's sleep, their well-being, and their general productivity. The article even quoted UK Health Security Agency figures saying that in the 2024 heatwaves, some 358 people deaths were recorded at home during the temperature, most likely down to the excess heat. I thought what was really curious about the article was the references to green infrastructure, especially green space and street trees and their role in combating this heat, in climate adaptation. And yet at the same time, I couldn't help but wonder, what is the role of green infrastructure for these high-rise apartments? Many of the temperatures that were quoted and the residents that were talking in the article were living at 20 stories and greater. So I think, and I'm hoping that our speakers today, our conversation today, will actually dive into some of these topics around climate adaptation, heat, risk, and the built environment. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker. Richard Miller is Deputy Head of Adaptation for the Climate Change Committee. And Richard's going to talk to us about current climate projections, why adaptation really matters, and the consequences of failing to act. So please, over to you, Richard, for perhaps a fuller introduction, if you like, and into your talk. Thanks so much.
Yes, thank you very much. And yeah, thank you for inviting me to speak to this group today. Let me just pull up my slides for you. Those should be coming through now. Please someone shout at me if there's any issues in seeing them, but I'll take silence as it's all fine. So yes, I'm delighted to be here. Yeah, my name is Richard Miller. I'm the Head of Adaptation at the Climate Change Committee. And I think I'm going to give you what I think is probably the sort of highest level, but hopefully a useful framing on the climate challenge in the UK and where we are in terms of tackling it in terms of adaptation. So I will jump into my talk. So just a little bit of intro on who we are at the Climate Change Committee and what our role is. So we're set up under the Climate Change Act in 2008 to be an independent body advising government on both emissions reduction and on adapting to the effects of climate change here in the UK. So our role is really three-pronged, really. So on the emissions reduction side, we're responsible for providing advice to the government every 5 years on the level of the UK's legislated carbon budgets, which is the legally binding level of emissions of greenhouse gases that step us down between where we are today and the net zero goal in 2050. And we most recently advised on that in early this year for the 7th carbon budget covering the 2035 period. But we also have a role on the resilience side. So there's a requirement on the government to produce a risk assessment every 5 years. And the CCC has to give advice on some of those risks and what we think we should do about it, which I'll speak a little bit more on exactly how that works in a second. And then our final role is to comment on progress on both emissions reduction and on adaptation, which we do every other year. And most recently, we published our adaptation progress assessment on where we think the country's national adaptation programme across all the different areas of climate risk and adaptation is in spring 2025. So on adaptation specifically, really the policy cycle for tackling this in the UK is set around this sort of 5-year iteration between the obligation to produce a climate change risk assessment, which was put to Parliament by the government most recently in 2022, and then the need for the government to set out a national adaptation programme that responds to those risks. And the most recent version of that, the 3rd National Adaptation Programme, was published in 2023. And what we do on the Climate Change Committee is provide some of the evidence for that. So our role is set out on the left-hand side of this slide by both providing advice on the risks and what the policy programmes can do to tackle it. But we are also been tasked by government in the past 2 CCRAs and in the current one, which we're working on for next year, to provide the independent assessment of the evidence base on climate risk, as well as our evaluation of progress on where we are. So what really is the climate challenge for the UK, and where are we in tackling it, and why does adaptation matter? So the way to obviously always start these things is, where are we globally? And so this will be a chart that's probably no doubt very familiar to all of you, but the global temperature time series from the pre-industrial proxy of 1850 to 1900, with that solid line in the middle being the estimate of the human-induced warming that we've created through current and past greenhouse gas emissions. So you can see from that we're about 1.3 degrees above pre-industrial and rising rapidly. So we're currently warming the planet at the rate of about 0.25 degrees per decade, which means based on that sort of current trajectory, we are going to be reaching that level of 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial that's set out as the lower bound of the Paris Agreement's goal within the next decade or so, probably the early 2030s, based on the current projection. So therefore, it's really this current national adaptation plan that we're in, and then the next one, which will run from 2028 to 2022, which will be the plans that either do or don't prepare the UK for what a climate at 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial actually it looks like, and continuing to warm thereafter, most likely. So that's obviously the global starting picture, but what have we seen in the UK thus far? So this chart really has just two time series of average change in both UK annual average temperatures on the left-hand side and sea levels on the right-hand side, using actually one of the longest running sea level records we have from Newlyn in Cornwall. And you can clearly see that sort of uptick in the long-term trend of these 2 time series. Well, we have variability, but it's clear that our climate has changed from even a few decades ago in terms of these average metrics. Now, obviously, these are just the average metrics here, but I think what's most damaging from climate change is often the extremes. And even just looking back through the past few years, you can see how the extremes we're experiencing have been changing and how they've been impactful. So even going back to as recently as summer 2022, everyone will remember the first time that we saw 40 degrees reached and exceeded in the UK in that heat wave in July 2022. As we just said in the introduction, a really significant spike in all-cause mortality associated with that, nearly 3,000 excess heat-related deaths coming across that summer of 2022, including that July 40-degree period, but also other heat waves we saw in the summer. And the real stress that brought to sort of wider infrastructure systems and even the delivery of key social services, such as about 1 in 5 GPs and healthcare settings reported cancellations due to theatre conditions that are just not fit to and safe to operate, as an example. That heat in the summer came off the back of a dry spring and summer in 2022, particularly dry in some parts of the country, the driest since the very dry year of 1976. Nearly 20 million people in some kind of water restriction across that summer, impacts on agriculture and risks of needing to manage the public water supply prudently. And we also saw wildfire. That combination of heat and drought really created this real spike in wildfires, something that we don't really often conceptualize much in the UK, particularly at the sort of urban fringe, and examples of Winnington in East London, where you saw properties directly destroyed by that fire, and about 500% spike in 999 calls on that middle of the July heatwave and fire that real put fire and rescue services under real pressure. But since that sort of hot period in sort of spring, summer 2022, then we then flipped into what was a warm and wet period, really, in the winters. So across 2020, late 2022 to sort of early 2024, it's about the 18 months of wettest period we'd ever seen on record for England. And some parts of England, in the south particularly, we saw about 150% of their typical rainfall over that period. Large amounts of farmland left underwater, and impacts on harvests. And we saw the second worst arable harvest since our modern records began. And obviously, particular storms we saw in that created quite some significant flooding impacts. Storm Babette as one particular example from late 2023 that had impacts displacing people from their houses, particularly in the north of England and Scotland. And against all of that, of course, we have the sort of rising chronic hazards around sea level rise, increasing sense around how some of our coastal sites and some heritage assets that are prized on, say, the south coast, coming under increasing threat, and homes falling into the sea in some parts of Norfolk. So that's really what we summarised in our progress report about some of the hazards. Obviously, since then, we've bounced back to a sort of warm and dry period through this year, where we've seen a very dry spring, water restriction measures coming into place again, and recent confirmation from the Met Office that summer 2025 was the warmest on record. So I think a real sense that these climate changes are here now. This is not an issue for either somebody else in some other part of the world or for a future time period. These changes have manifested here today and are having impacts on society today in the UK. So what does that mean for where we're going, and what do the risks of those create? So if we're looking ahead for what's the credible trajectories of global change that we should be planning for part of this, if you look on the left-hand side of this chart, it really shows that we need to be planning now for a sort of central climate scenario that reaches 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial in the 2030s and continues to rise to about 2 degrees warmer than pre-industrial by the middle of the century, and then potentially as high as 2.5 to 3 degrees by the end of the century. And this is based on just current policy commitments from governments around the world. So as part of that, we need to be cognizant of the uncertainty in how the climate does respond to emissions. And under a high climate sensitivity scenario, which is what the right-hand side shows here, you could see temperatures under the same emission scenarios rising to around 4 degrees or even a little bit higher by the end of the century. In the UK, this is going to mean that continued trend to sort of hotter and drier summers and warmer and wetter winters on average, and rainfall being more intense at all times of year when it does fall. And again, turning that into extremes, we know that under this kind of trajectory, the sort of heat extremes we saw in 2022, where we saw 40 degrees reached, we expect a 50-50 chance that on this trajectory we will see a similar exceedance of 40 degrees in the UK within the next decade or so, with temperatures already being possible to be somewhere between 40 and 45 based on newest estimates from the Met Office. So continuing exacerbation of these extremes which we've been seeing just in the past few years. What does that mean in terms of risks to the UK? So really our task in the last climate change risk assessment, the climate change risk assessment 3, was to identify these risks and to assess their urgency. So just to show you the overall picture of what this looks like here, we actually found in that risk assessment 61 different risks and opportunities that were sort of scored in that assessment. And the vast majority of these were scored in the sort of highest urgency category here. So the sort of red, dark red here, it's about 30 of those risks that we felt was a really clear case from the evidence that more action was needed to tackle those now. And those range from impacts on nature and ecosystems through to people's health and well-being from extreme temperatures and flooding. So many of the things that the session is going to pick up today around the role of trees and nature in the urban landscapes to help tackle this. So a real sense of a broad distribution of risks, but pretty much a compelling picture that all of them could benefit from adaptation now to sort of save impacts in the longer term. And then turning to where we think we are on tackling that challenge. So our most recent progress report in 2025 was to set out and answer that question of, what are we doing, and are we doing enough to address these risks identified by the risk assessment? And this chart shows really our summary of delivery and implementation of adaptation on the ground, with the sort of coloured bars here being our assessment for sort of fraction of the different adaptation outcomes we're looking for in our assessment, that we think there's good evidence we're moving in the right way. There's sort of partial evidence that many of the indicators are tracking well, but there's a bit more complicated picture, through to where we think there's just really insufficient evidence, or all the indicators are moving in clearly the wrong direction. And as you can see from the sort of just the color splash of this chart here, there's a lot of red and there's a lot of sort of darker amber here. So we think for most of the areas of adaptation that we look at, we think there's just no evidence really that we're driving at a national scale much change in the delivery and implementation of key aspects that can improve our resilience. You can see actually none of these areas that we looked at, and we looked at sort of 45 different outcomes across these 5 different areas that you have on the chart here. None of them scored in our highest category of good, where we thought there's unambiguous evidence that we had good indicators of delivery showing things were clearly moving in the right direction. So a lot to do on delivery of adaptation. We also look at policies and planning on adaptation, and that's where we see a bit more of a positive picture. You can already see there's elements of green coming onto this chart and yellow. So we do actually think across different areas of government planning, there are some patches of good. In most areas, we do have some policies and plans in place, but that sort of contrast between the previous chart shows that the real challenge here is to take some sensible approaches to policies and planning that's starting to appear across the policy space, and actually connect it to delivery on the ground. That remains, I think, the critical challenge that is holding back adaptation in the UK, is moving beyond just planning to sort of large-scale delivery of action. And really, our assessment concluded with 4 key areas where our committee made recommendations about strengthening the adaptation plan to address those gaps that the assessment highlighted from the action we're taking today. First is to set out improved objectives and targets. So we don't really have a sense of what we're trying to do nationally with adaptation at the moment. Someone described it to me once as, we have the equivalent goals of, we will reduce some carbon by some date, in some amount. We have not really a specific yardstick around what good adaptation is seeking to do, and therefore to sort of step back and say, well, what's needed to get there? What's needed to sort of tackle the action at sufficient scale? So we think that's a critical first step, is a government-led process to establish clear objectives and targets that everything else can hang off for adaptation. Secondly, is improved coordination across government. This is still an issue that's seen as an issue that needs to be the responsibility of DEFRA, which is the coordinating department, but it's across government that needs to engage with this. And those sort of integration activities need to get much more strong and make this a real priority for other departments. Thirdly, integrating adaptation into relevant policies. We know that there's activities happening to deliver the missions that governments had until recently, and many of those will affect how we experience climate risk in the future. For instance, delivery of some of the infrastructure that is being rolled out under the 10-year infrastructure plan. The design of those needs to have a changing climate integrated to avoid locking in additional climate risk and tackling this most cost effectively. And finally, is to improve monitoring, evaluation, and learning across all sectors. We know that many of the areas, actually, we just find gaps where we cannot really track progress sufficiently well. It's finally time for a sort of proper programme to build in place for government to track its own efforts and meaning that we can really learn what's working and what's not, and improve over time. Final slide I just wanted to end on really was just on what we are doing next in the CCC. So we are currently, as I mentioned at the top, working on the next programme of evidence that will feed in to the next climate change risk assessment and the subsequent national adaptation plan. And really what we're trying to do in that one is to provide, as well as an updated picture on what are the risks, what are the challenges from climate change, which we're working with a Met Office-led consortium to deliver. We're also going to produce a new product as part of this, which is what we're calling the Well-Adapted UK report, which tackles that challenge of what is the evidence on what good adaptation might look like from a national government perspective. What are the sort of target levels of climate resilience? What are the actions needed to manage those risks? So we will be working on that now, and we'll be publishing that in spring 2026. So yeah, very grateful, I think, for input from colleagues on this call and otherwise to help us find the right evidence there. Great, I think that's everything I wanted to say, so I will stop there and say thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Richard. First of all, for such a well-timed talk, but also fascinating and really interesting talk. Because you are so nicely on schedule, we do have time for a couple of questions, and there have been a few popping up along the way. But I think I'm going to quickly ask, first of all, you've talked very much about the national picture, but to what extent do you boil that down into, say, a regional picture or a difference between urban and non-urban? Because I think that could be particularly challenging in light of today's conversations.
Yeah, it's absolutely challenging, and I think, you know, we have that slightly challenging role to acknowledge that absolutely adaptation is local and place-based, and that is where it's actually delivered, and all of those details absolutely matter. But then our exam question is to the national government to say, well, what does this look like in the round actually? So I think when we do our work, we find loads of good examples of good things, great stuff happening at local level, but often our challenge is to say, well, is that indicative of what's happening in the round? And what can you learn to scale up some of those examples for the sort of national rollout? So yeah, I think we tried to draw out where, you know, even where we find the national picture, we don't have great evidence that's just nationally, you know, we were going in the right direction. That does not mean there are not good patches, and you know, pointing towards what can be learned from those things, and therefore hopefully scaled up a bit more widely.
Thank you. I mean, that does relate to a question that was put in the chat there. So, I mean, what to you does a well-adapted UK look like? I mean, perhaps you can name a couple of the key evidence points that you're looking for, both locally and nationally.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, ultimately, I think my first answer to that question is that I think that needs to be owned by, the answer to that question needs to properly be owned by politicians ultimately, because there is a sort of trade-off in there around what different dimensions of good look like. However, I do think there are things you can point to that I think most people would relatively reasonably expect should be part of that. Take infrastructure, for example. I think it's, you know, relatively uncontroversial to say that probably, unless there's a really good reason, you probably should expect infrastructure services to work as well as they do today, despite the challenges of the future. You know, where we've set other government goals like environmental improvement goals on nature, goals for the economy, whatever they might be, we expect that those should be able to be delivered regardless of the climate challenges that might be phrased to them. And then I think there's probably also, you know, realistic expectation from the public that some services will just work no matter the weather, and that might not be the trains. I think people accept that, you know, there'll be times when the trains might not work and you might have to adapt in a different way, but something like A&E, I think there's probably a sense that that should be an all-weather service. But I think ultimately it should really be government who will sort of articulate that so that they can own those judgments and the trade-offs it brings, and to therefore sort of set out how you actually measure that destination much more concretely.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, I might suggest one more rather broad question, as we've got just a couple of minutes to keep us on schedule. But David has asked, has the shutdown of the North Atlantic conveyor been considered? And I know it's something I always wonder in these sort of debates, so I'm going to put that one in just while we got time in this window. So
yeah, so I mean, absolutely, I think we want to sort of consider the possibilities of those actions, those outcomes happening as part of climate adaptation planning, and, you know, through the risk assessment, we're trying to strike that balance between, yes, bringing in those aspects of the those deep uncertainties from the science, while also trying to maintain a clear sort of focus on the things we do know as well. But I think ultimately where it really probably feeds through, and I think the key question that always should be asked on these is what do you do differently off the back of it? And I think to me that always points to trying to find robustness in the adaptation interventions we might recommend. Are they robust to faster rates of warming? Are they robust to the kinds of changes that you might see, like, things happening with the Atlantic circulation, and really prioritizing the ones that are the most robust for the sort of more near-term deployment, because it's going to keep your optionality open depending on how these different things do or don't manifest over the next few decades or so.
It's a really wise answer, having sort of a plan A and a plan B. Are they going to be robust in the event of several different things happening? So, and of course, there was that report recently, wasn't there, that there might even be a backup to the North Atlantic conveyor. So thank you so much for now, Richard. I think we'll turn to our second speaker. So Oscar, if you can bring your camera on ready in anticipation. And we'll come back to a broader conversation later on, everybody. So keep your questions coming, please. So our second speaker is Oscar Bruce, a lecturer in urban climate, and he's going to talk to us, at UCL, I should say that. And he's going to talk to us today about urban climate and trees. So thanks very much, and over to you, Oscar.
Thank you, Kieron. Hello, everyone. Happy to be here. So my name is Oscar Bruce. I'm a lecturer at UCL at the Bartlett's Institute of Environmental Design and Engineering. I'm an urban climatologist and an environmental geographer by training. And so today, I'll be talking about urban climate and trees. And I'll especially be talking about tools for estimating their impact. I'm happy that we just had someone from the CCRA presenting just before, and myself contributing to the writing of the technical report. And one thing we noticed in particular is the lack of capacities for measuring the impact of the interventions for adaptation and mitigation of climate changes. And so I'll be talking about this mostly in this presentation. So here you see a picture of the east of London around the Olympic Park, a place that is a high focus of our studies. I'll talk about it a bit later. So there are many ways for measuring the impact of cities on the local climate. In this figure, you can see a summary of them. So you will have satellites, for example, embarked sensors on planes, weather balloons at the top of towers. There's, of course, ground weather measurements as well, typical automatic weather stations, or embarked weather stations on cars, for example. That's also a possibility. And all of these have been developed mostly over the past 70 years through an evolution of urban climatology and also atmospheric physics. And basically, researchers have developed tools for measuring the things they had to do. There was a major driver that was air pollution, that led to the development of a whole variety of tools for measuring the circulation of air and its temperature, pressures, humidity, etc. in cities. And we are still inheriting from all of this period. And however, one thing that we face often as urban climatologists is a typical data scarcity. So most of those measurement campaigns have been driven by official institutions like the Met Office, and they do an amazing job. There are standards for deploying those weather stations, for example, and however, they are often lacking in cities because of how complex the urban environment is and how varied and heterogeneous it can be. And so if we want to be capable of measuring what's actually happening where people live, we need a densification of this network. So this is something that was noticed already quite a while ago, and there has been some pioneering studies and projects during the year 2000s, 2010s, with an example here of Birmingham, where you can see in what they tried to do is basically alleviate the lack of measurements coming from the Met Office here in green. And they asked the question, what type of weather sensors would we actually need? Do we need really high quality weather sensors? So here in blue, in the blue square, or could low cost weather sensors be useful? They found out that low cost weather sensors work well, but that again, if you work from a top-down approach and you have an institution that is responsible of maintaining all of this network, basically it costs too much and it's too complicated to maintain. And therefore, low-cost weather sensors cannot be maintained by a single institution. This is why we've been highly reliant on the Internet of Things. And here is an example of one of the weather sensors that we have been using quite a lot in urban climatology, the NetAtmo weather station. And basically, these are crowdsourced weather data. So it's a weather station that anyone can buy, and people can choose to share the data from their outdoor weather sensor on a cloud. And actually we can access this cloud and then we can gather the data. And so here is an example over the city of the southeast of England and London, where in purple you see the locations over this several hundreds, if not thousands of kilometers square area coming from the UK Met Office automatic weather station network from the Midas, it's called Midas. And in the black dots, you see all of these personal weather stations, crowdsourced personal weather stations that can be all of a sudden accessed. Now, as I was saying before, automatic weather stations from official institutions, of course, come with a high level of expectations in terms of standards for deployment. This is, of course, less the case for personal weather stations. And so urban climatologists have come up with solutions to cope with this issue. And we, for example, rely heavily on some sort of statistical filterings. And here at the top, you see the data before this filtering is applied, and at the bottom, you see after the filtering. And basically, the goal here is to get rid of any human-induced mistakes. So, for example, you will see that there's a whole line of at around 20 degrees. It's probably that the people who bought the sensors went like, well, I have two sensors. Why would I bother put one of them in indoor and the other outdoor when I can actually have a measurement of my living room as well as my kitchen's temperature, and maybe this is more interesting to me. So this is what the type of data we get rid of. And once we do that, we are capable of reproducing similar types of studies that were done in urban climatology. So for example, comparing different types of environments. So here, typically we see that a very dense environment will be warmer by about 2 degrees to less dense environments or vegetated environments. So linking to trees here, we see that one of the coolest environments is the dense trees. That is for the city of Berlin. And of course, we already know that from previous measurement campaigns, but by acquiring such a vast amount of data, we're capable of extending the knowledge to many different places that were not necessarily being studied before, and validating the privacy hypothesis, and also delivering a message that is relevant to local authorities. Because saying that the temperature in a park was 2 degrees cooler in Chicago, if you're actually interested in the people who live in Manchester, is probably not very useful for you. So now this is only things that are coming from those weather stations. Some things we did with colleagues from Oslo was to try to map out air temperature using those personal weather stations, because they are now so densely populating our cities, and using satellite images to do that. So this is what we did in this work. And we found out that, of course, densifying helps obtaining more accurate maps of air temperature, which you can see here by the increase of the R square on the left side. Nevertheless, there's some sort of a plateauing effect. So there's only that much we can do with merging satellite images and personal weather stations, which is a bit problematic. It means that there's quite a high uncertainty in the air temperature maps that you could get out of those weather stations. It's been since then demonstrated that surface temperature, which is often used, is actually quite decorrelated from air temperature, which is a work here that colleagues Chakraborty and others have actually demonstrated in one of their paper, is that air temperature is decorrelated poorly correlated to NDVI, which is an indicator of the vegetation index, whereas surface temperature is highly correlated. But because surface temperature is also decorrelated from air temperature, this explains why there is this sort of plateauing effect by using satellite images to map out air temperature across your urban environment. On top of this, we have been studying the inequalities in coverage of those personal weather stations in England and Wales, and we found out that the wealthier the area is, the higher the chance of having a personal weather station is. So you always have to think about the fact that any message you get out of these crowdsourced personal weather station data is probably more related to wealthy districts than to poor districts, which of course is a problem when it comes to, for example, coping with heat-related risks in vulnerable areas where people have less means of protecting themselves from heat. So that's the whole context around the type of measurements we use. And so once we have done all of this work, we're actually capable of looking at things that are of interest to us, and especially what is the effect of trees on the health of people. So we use these data for London for the years 2015 to 2022, including the very important heat wave of 2022. And we found out that deciles of places around personal weather stations that had the highest tree coverage were in general cooler than the ones that had the least, something that we would expect, but we quantified this. And then using some sort of statistical relationship, which is called an exposure response function, we are capable of assessing how trees, by lowering the air temperature, are actually having a positive impact on the health of people. How much would you expect to save lives by having trees planted in certain areas of London in that case? So this is what we did in this work, and we found out that the current tree coverage in London is already reducing the impact of the additional heat brought by the urban heat island by about 16% for the years 2015 to 2022. That the London strategy of increasing the tree coverage by about 10% would reduce this to 26%. And that if we replaced all the available space on the ground except for the buildings, we would reduce that by a maximum of 55%. We also found out, and this is what you see on this plot, that basically this is consistent across current climates and future climates, and that having trees in your city is also benefiting public health in the future when temperatures are increasing. Now, this is relying only on those personal weather stations and so in situ measurements, but we also run regional climate models that have an urban climate model embedded in them. And that allows us to test many adaptation strategies. And so this is what we did in this work, which has received quite a bit of public attention last year, because we found out that the most effective way for coping with heat during very extreme heat days in London could actually be cool roofs. And we were quite surprised to see that changing the natural land use land cover in our model would only marginally reduce the air temperatures on average, which is what you see here at the top right corner with deciduous tree tiles. And so we didn't pick up this specific adaptation strategy for a heat-related mortality study that we've done afterwards, where we ran one of those scenarios not only for the extreme days, but for the whole summer of 2018, and where we found out that cool roofs could reduce quite importantly the amount of mortality attributable to heat for the summer of 2018, and which would result basically to a saving of about 615 million pounds based on value of statistical life. You also see that even if you don't have a city, people still die because there is an extreme heat wave or because it's an extremely hot summer, which is what you see represented here by the no urban heat island, which you could consider as a maximum effect of, or like a counterfactual where everything is replaced by vegetation. Now, as I was saying, we were lacking data, and we, despite using models, etc., we wanted to complement, alleviate this data scarcity that we face. And so we've been deploying sensors in the east of London, referring back to the picture I was showing to you before, when we use those basically weather stations that are low cost as well, and have a radiation shield, and we attach them to lampposts, as you can see in the urban environments. And in the parks, we put them on top of bamboos because we have no capacity for finding any lampposts. And this is done in the Olympic Park and around. And we did this to basically look at the benefits that are provided by parks and treed and vegetated areas in the east of London, which is known to be probably more vulnerable to heat-related mortality. And we found out that across all year, any place that is located further to this park is actually experiencing hotter temperatures, which could be related to a higher heat stress or a higher heat-related mortality eventually. And the ones that are closer to the park are cooler in general. The park remains cooler all year long. The difference in temperature is more pronounced during summer, of course, but during winter it is also cooler, which could be seen as a negative effect somehow, depending on who you ask. And so this is quite informative when it comes to having access to what we call cool islands. So how far should be that we have access to vegetated areas which are protective to extreme temperatures, and in this case around the Olympic Park, for example. So that's a work that is currently being reviewed in meteorological application, and had received minor revision, so hopefully soon to be published. And on that, I would like to end this talk, and I'm happy to have questions if there is time, or during the discussions afterwards. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Oscar. Once again, brilliant timing. So for that, there are many questions coming up along the way, and I think we do have indeed time for a few as we go. I think the first one that's particularly interesting is from Sarah Collins, and you asked about, or you mentioned about cool roofs. Can you give us a bit more detail on those, how you define those for us? Because that'd be great at this time. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. So the way we represent cool roofs in those models is by simply increasing the reflective capacity of roof to a value of 0.85 in their albedo, so an 85% capacity of reflection of the incoming solar radiation. This is what is usually branded in the literature. Of course, the value is actually lower often because of weathering, etc., etc. But these are things that we cannot integrate in our models. So again, there is very little evidence on the actual impact that those roofs have locally and across a city, because there is very little work done in having follow-up studies. This is something, again, that comes out of the CCRA that we are currently working on. So happy to have a chat about it later as well. Yeah.
So you'd very much like to see buildings have their albedo reduced and then look at the actual change that occurs from that. You'd like to see those change studies happening.
Yes, because we are heavily reliant on models for now. So this is all, of course, we trust our models. We evaluate them before, we parameterize them in the most realistic way, etc., etc. But they are, of course, prone to uncertainties, and we want to quantify these as best as possible. And we cannot quantify the uncertainties of the interventions at the moment.
Thank you. And for those on the call who might not be so familiar with albedo, I mean, how would you suggest you did that? I mean, you know, the classic sort of Greek village type approach of painting white. Yeah, and those, and any other good examples that you might?
There is currently a lot of engineering around it, especially in the US, because they are quite a fan of the technology, and it's becoming also really well used in informal settlements in places around the equator and in the tropics. Basically, it's painting the roof white, so that's the most typical one. But then there are other types of coatings which are capable at having a higher reflectance, or actually having a higher emissivity, so they also emit more the heat towards the atmosphere during cooling hours, etc., etc. But basically the typical example is indeed paint your roof white, and that's a cool roof already.
Yeah, emissivity, that's one that we might want to spend some time talking about another time. So brilliant. And just one last question. The little personal weather stations you were talking about, I mean, they look very much like Alexa type units to me. But just a point of clarity, what you said at the beginning, they are actually installed outside, correct? And the fact that some people install them inside is what was giving you the error of reading. Yeah, okay.
Yes.
I suppose because they look like Alexa type buildings, I was just double checking you. Yeah, you did want them outside. Fantastic. So we are heading into our third speaker. So we'll take some more questions later, and there are plenty coming your way, Oscar. So thank you for that. But
thank you very much.
Thank you. We're now going to welcome our guest speaker number 3, so Emma Franti. She is a project leader of WM Adapt. Hopefully you'll tell us what that acronym stands for in a minute, Emma. And of course, you're an associate professor of civil engineering at the University of Birmingham. So over to you for your talk, please, Emma. Thank you.
Thanks, Kieran. Have my slides come up okay?
They have indeed. Yeah, thank you.
Perfect. So, hi, Emma Franti, School of Engineering, University of Birmingham. I work on lots of projects related to climate resilience, including the next climate change risk assessment. And a lot of us have done a lot of work with Birmingham and the region around climate resilience. So let me see if I can forward my slides. I can. So this presentation today is about how we take the stuff that we know about trees and green space providing cooling, and then try and integrate it into the planning system so that we can create greener and more climate resilient cities for the future. So second time Birmingham's had a mention today, and we've not even mentioned the bin strikes yet, but Birmingham is the UK's second city. It's a young city. We have a strong demand for housing. We have many wards in the top 10% of the indices of multiple deprivation. Like many urban areas, we have high-rise, compact buildings, which create an urban heat island, but there's very little known about the overheating risk. We have pluvial and fluvial flooding, and we also have economic challenges within the city because the council was declared bankrupt in 2022. But the thing I think everybody should know about Birmingham is that Birmingham is beautiful. Somebody described it as countryside trapped in the city. And I forgot where I heard that quote. So if the person is online today, please feel free to let me know that I've stolen your quote. But it's beautiful. We have some lovely areas of urban forestry, many parks, 6 million trees, a high percentage canopy cover. And over the last decade, there's been this real vision for how we can incorporate green space within the city. So we became a biophilic city in 2014, a tree city of the world. We had our urban forest master plan in 2021. We have a climate risk and vulnerability assessment, which makes us an A-list city for climate action, along with lots of other good stuff. And only, I think, a month or a few weeks ago now, we became the UK's first nature city in 2025. And so this work's been led by the City Council, who have this really strong vision for what trees can do for the city. We've also done a lot of research, not just myself, but plenty of others at the university, thinking about urban climatology. Back in the day of national indicators around 2016, we had a climate adaptation plan, and the first image you can see on the left is from the work done there, where we looked at the urban heat island intensity. This led into more work that was delivered by the council as part of the Urban Forest Accelerator, and they looked at how we could map environmental justice across the city. And at the same time, I was sort of taking the opposite approach to Oscar and thinking about how little data you could possibly have to be able to map heat vulnerability across the city. And so I was doing some work with GIS. And what we did a couple of years ago was bring all of these things together to create a climate risk and vulnerability assessment for the city. So climate risk and vulnerability assessment, I'll probably abbreviate it to CRVA moving forward. But it's a very simple approach. You bring together all sorts of different data on climate risks, so things like overheating risk, flood risk, along with data on green space and canopy cover, and then socioeconomic indicators such as indices of multiple deprivation. And you combine all of these data sets together using GIS, and you can create a climate risk and vulnerability surface for the city. And so what this shows you is where in the city or the region is the highest areas of risk and vulnerability. And then that starts to help you understand where you can prioritize your action and what actions are important in that particular area. So the data, the method that we have here is open access. If you scan the QR code, I hope it still works. And the data is open access and the approach is open access. And I think I'd like to think that any local authority in the UK should be able to just copy that approach with the data that you have available. This is the map for Birmingham. You can see climate risk and vulnerability across the city. Green is lower risk and vulnerability, red is higher. And what we tend to notice is that the highest areas of risk and vulnerability tend to follow the river routes, which is because this is where we have the old industry, this is where the infrastructure went in, we've got higher levels of flood risk and also poorer quality housing, and these sort of things all compound to increase risk and vulnerability. That information is available on Birmingham City Council website. And once we produced the map together, what we did then was hand the map over to the city. It now sits within the GIS team. They are responsible for updating it. And so all the input information that feeds into the maps, so the flood risk maps, the indices of multiple deprivation, when they update, Birmingham's climate risk and vulnerability assessment will update. And because it sits with the planning team and the GIS team, it's now starting to be embedded within planning processes within the city. So I have a slide here from Simon Needle, who, along with Nick Grayson, have been a couple of the people who've really pushed this biophilic master planning forward over the years. And this is a slide that shows how we bring together the climate risk and vulnerability assessment with information that we know from the local nature recovery strategy and the biophilic master plan, bringing together all these different layers to think about when we design something for Birmingham, how can we design it so that we are addressing both the climate challenges and the biodiversity challenges and creating somewhere beautiful and healthy where people want to live. This is an example from the Green Infrastructure Master Plan from East Birmingham. You can see that if you look on the far left of the slide, you can see that that's the climate risk and vulnerability score for the city. We can see that it's red, so it's an area which does have higher risks and vulnerability. And then that's used to try and think, how can we bring this together with what we know from the Nature Recovery Network to create an opportunities plan for that particular area? And so this is how we're bringing together climate risk, green space and biodiversity ambitions within the city to in master planning. And again, that's a slide from Simon Needle. The other thing that we're very active in on the city is we have a really strong charity called Birmingham Tree People. They monitor and measure the city's trees. If you've got any questions about that, please put them in the chat, because Deanne Brettle, who also helps out at TDAG, is the chair for Birmingham Tree People. But what we're doing with BTP is we're planting new street trees in Birmingham in areas where we have low tree canopy cover, and thinking about how we can address climate risk and vulnerability via that planting. So that's a really big project because once the trees go into the ground, we then need people to find them, to water them, and we're also monitoring the establishment of those trees through time. So any questions on that, please ask Deanne, and that slide is from her. So I've talked a little bit about Birmingham. What we did after we'd done the mapping work with Birmingham is we went large and we started to map the West Midlands region with the combined authority. So very similar approach, bringing together different data sets to try and understand how risk and vulnerability varied across the region. The work we did with the West Midlands is slightly more sophisticated because it includes more data sets. But I think whether you include 10 data sets or whether you include 20 data sets, you will see the same sort of picture of which areas have higher risk and vulnerability and which areas have less. Again, the mapping approach is available online for download. And this work is stored upon the West Midlands Combined Authority website, along with lots of other information that the Combined Authority have done for climate adaptation. The West Midlands Combined Authority have a climate adaptation manager. They are very proactive, and they reported as part of the as part of the climate change risk assessment process. They reported on the risks and challenges to the region and how they hope to tackle them moving forward. And at the university, we're helping to progress the work with the city and the work with the region by 2 separate research projects. So I'll speak a little bit about those now. So the Carmine project is something that we work on with Birmingham City Council. It is a huge EU project with, I think, 32 different partners from 11 countries. There are 8 case study areas, and within these different case study areas, we are trying to create climate resilient development pathways. And there's all sorts of whizzy things happening. There are digital twins, there are living labs, there's lots of modelling. But what we're trying to do in the Birmingham case study area is do something really useful for the city. So we're thinking about how how we can use modelling to help teachers about vegetation management in the future, and that's done in collaboration with the Met Office. And then think about how we can bring all of the stakeholders together to create the vision for the Urban Forest Master Plan, and also monitor the adaptation plan moving forward. And we also have PhDs. It also funds the PhD work that's done by Deanne Brettel and also Naya, who's on the call today, thinking about tree establishment and drought from space. On the WM Adapt programme, research project, sorry, this is West Midlands Adapt. This is working in collaboration with the West Midlands Combined Authority to do 3 different things. And the first thing I'll tell you about is workstream 2. So this is about the climate risk and vulnerability assessment mapping. All the work that we've done to date has been in the current climate. And so what we're doing now is we're thinking about how we can include climate projections in that work, and how we can think about how, if we change the region, what does that mean for our surface water flood risk, and what does that mean for our overheating risk? And we're also bringing in new information on economic mapping, and also mapping the health burden of flooding and overheating risk. Workstream 1 is super exciting. We've been delivering wild weather cafes all summer. These are cafes that take place in wards where we have people from the community who are paid for their time. They're brought along, and we're really trying to get that community perspective on what extreme weather means in the West Midlands and what people think we should be doing to adapt to climate change from their perspective. And then Workstream 3 is about kind of creating this regional adaptation network that brings together all the people who do adaptation as a small part of their role, and along with 100 other things every day, so that all these small little things add up to, oh gosh, I can never get this phrase right. All these small bits add together to be greater than the individual parts. And so all this work is done in collaboration with the Combined Authority. And the idea is that this project delivers a step change in adaptation, and that also we lay the grounds for adaptation to continue beyond the end of the research project. So please connect with Carmine. I mentioned West Midlands Adapt, which is funded by UKRI under the MAC Hub. There are also 5 other research projects happening in this space, and if you want to find out anything else about those, you can click on the QR code there. Because I've been having such a fabulous time speaking, I have no idea how long I have been talking for, Kieron, but that was my last slide. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emma. Again, brilliant timing. In fact, a little bit early finishing, so you might have to get an extra couple of questions right now. I hope that's okay with you, but really enjoyed that.
I'd love more questions.
The first one, if you can, I'll just take the privilege of asking, is just a bit of clarity, please. You said about tree board, but you didn't really go into the detail on that. And I wonder if you can explain what that might look like and how you plan to implement that. That'd be great.
Sure. So Birmingham has an urban forest master plan, and it has targets on how we would like our urban forest to be managed moving forward. The tree board is set up to monitor the implementation of the implementation of the urban forest master plan. So it's separate to the city council. It has no we can't mandate acts, but what we can do is we can review progress against the targets, and we can provide recommendations. And I sort of feel, and I hope Richard doesn't mind me saying this, but for me, I sort of imagine it as being like the climate change committee. We can monitor progress, we can suggest things, but we don't actually have the capacity. No, we don't actually have the legal authority to change things within the city. So the tree
Okay.
board, it's in its infancy. It's been set up for a couple of years, and it's going through a bit of a resurgence at the moment via the Carmine project.
Fantastic. So it's a group of people overseeing and watching from the outside, rather than perhaps saying a dashboard of performance indicators, which on the one hand can be interesting, but on the other hand can reduce it down to sometimes meaningless numbers, can't it? So
There are KPIs, Kieron. I think it's sort of watch this space. I don't know of any other tree boards, so we're trying to understand how to be a good tree board whilst being a tree board.
I might need to speak to you separately about this on with relation to one of the cost actions that's currently running on urban forest strategies. And actually, I think some of the things you're doing there should really feed into that broader European learning. So that's great. And actually, one other question, well, we've got time. Scarlett has asked, are there any examples from other cities of a CRVA that you talked about so clearly for Birmingham?
Thank you. So, so the GLA have one. The Greater London Authority have their own climate risk and vulnerability assessment. It was produced by Bloomsburg, I think, and I can find the link for you and pop it in the chat. I think I'd be interested to know if there's anybody on the call who can tell me about whether there's anything like this in the other big cities within the UK. I think there's been some work mapping overheating risk in Bristol, and generally, I think north of the border, where I think there's better processes and perhaps policy for adaptation, I think there might be some good examples from Scotland too.
Fantastic. Brilliant. Thanks very much. And just one more, I think Sue's reacted to the comment on KPIs, and we've got a couple more minutes before to keep us on schedule, but actually seeing the thoughts, are we agreed that KPIs are critical for monitoring urban forest master plans or tree strategies?
Oh, I don't know the answer to that, Sue. I think if you want to monitor progress on anything, then you need to have a baseline, and then you need to measure yourself against the baseline. And with my climate change risk assessment hat on, one of the things that we found really difficult in terms of finding evidence for is evidence that adaptation is working, because we don't have the baseline and we're not necessarily monitoring. So all the great adaptation work that might be happening, we're not able to evidence it. So I think love them or hate them, you need some way of measuring progress.
It's a
and
really
justifying investment.
Yeah. But so often the things that we desire are outputs, not outcomes. I've learned from, research and looking into this over the years, and actually to get a KPI or reduce it down to a number for an outcome actually is often so much harder and takes that much more thinking. But it doesn't mean we should shy away from the challenge, because like you say, if you're going to demonstrate delivery and change, then, well, by very definition, you need something to demonstrate it against, don't you? So we're going to move on now, Emma, and hopefully there'll be some more questions and a conversation shortly, but we're going to move to our fourth and final speaker. So Kevin Martin, Head of Collections and Arboriculture at Royal Botanic Gardens Kew. Clearly, Kevin's a keenly favours short talk titles. So Kevin's going to talk to us about climate risk to trees, and therefore which urban trees we should plant for the expected future climate. So Kevin, if you're there and ready, please.
I'm
Fantastic.
ready. Right.
Over to you. Thank you.
Great. So I'm going to talk about how we've been using various different techniques now to start looking at how we can select better urban trees. So I'm not going to dwell too long on urban heat islands, because I think we've covered that enough this afternoon. We all know the issues that we're going to see. As we move forward, we're going to see a big push towards bigger populations within our urban environments. Therefore, the urban infrastructure is going to be a lot more exposed to climate change. And we all know that that's going to increase our greenhouse gas emissions and developing these urban microclimates. So really, this is all started from doing a big assessment for Kew and our living collections. So from that, we then started to understand how we could possibly use modelling to start looking at the impact on our living collections here at Kew. We have a big job here in just not managing the urban part around Kew, but also mainly in the botanic gardens. So we need to understand consequence of climate change for a botanic garden in an urban environment. So this is where the work really started. So we looked at various different ways to do this, looked at mortality data, looked at how we could use different mechanisms to try and make this assessment. But in the end, from doing my studies at Lancaster University, we then realised that really looking at climate and climate models and species distribution modelling was probably our best way forward. So to really start that, we have to understand what we're looking for. So this is a PCA plot. So this is an assessment of all the climate variables. So there's 52 climate variables. And when we're looking, we have to really understand what variables we need to look at. And we to understand how that will influence plants. So what we see here, this is all 52 climate variables that are available to use. So this goes from precipitation to humidity to aridity and so on and so forth. So what we want to understand is how do these climate variables drive plant observations in the wild? And that's what this is. So this is a select group of tree species and all their wild observation data. And then we wanted to understand what variable is driving that observation. So the outcome of this really was that when we look at observations and we look at variables, really what we have to try to understand is the amount of drought and the intensity of drought and length. So to do that, we found that the Thornwaites climatic moisture index, which allows us to create a classification for climate, was the best way forward. So what this allows us to do is basically look at humidity and the precipitation, but also potential evapotranspiration. Now, we know from lots of different experiments that we've done here at Kew and observations that when we look at humidity, that is a real big driver when we look at water demand in plants. So therefore, that then drives the observation in the wild. So by understanding this, we've then been able to start making plots in models to start to understand how the climate shifting will affect a plant observation or the ability for us to grow it. So if we look at these plots, so what we're seeing here is each dot is an observation point of a species. So this is using big plots of over 10,000 points where possible, when there is that observation data there. Now, this is based on Kew, and we can see these different data points. So we've got a 1981, a 2020, and 2090. Now, what's really interesting, these are plotted in Climate World. So this is based on mean annual temperature for the growing season. So that's approximately 8 months. And then we use climatic moisture index. So we're looking at the length and severity of drought. So what we can see here is how we start to shift. So if we look currently for species like Acer platanoides and Carpinus betulus, our common hornbeam, we can see that currently in our current climate, we are sitting just comfortably in the center of their observation. So therefore, we know that the tree will have the tools and the plasticity to deal with our current climate. Now, what we see as we go through climate change, and this is all based off the SSP3, we see that acceleration. So the acceleration of increased temperature and the increase on water demand, we can see how that moves, how that plant is going to perform in a landscape. So what we can see here, by 2090, we're really going to be on the outside edge of that plant's observation. Now, that will show us what plants and where we should select seed from for the future. But when we start looking at plants and future trees, especially for our urban environments, we can now see that for species like Carpinus orientalis, so the oriental hornbeam, but also Coleteria paniculata, the golden rain tree, what's interesting here is we become better suited to grow these species in our warmer parts of the environment. So our urban environments, our urban heat islands. So we can see here for Carpinus orientalis there in 1981 and 2020, we're on the colder side. So the colder and wetter of that species observation. But as we get warmer, we can start to see this shift, and you can see we become more favorable. So as we get warmer and drier, this species is predicted to perform better in our landscape. And it's the same picture for Coleteria paniculata. So this then really allows us to use this analytical approach to start understanding what species we should be looking at as we look into the future for our urban trees. Now, this all formed part of the Kew's landscape succession plan. By using this methodology, we could then start to look at the potential impact at Kew. Now, if we look at this overall map, so obviously each dot is a tree in our collection, and we can see the dots in red that they're unfortunately we know are going to really struggle, and they're really vulnerable under future climate scenarios, so they're not suitable to be replaced in the landscape. So if those trees get removed from our landscape, we're not going to replace with the same species, because we know on these projections that they're going to be unsuitable. Now, all the green dots are the good news ones. They're the ones that we know that are really well suited, and they have that adjustment to deal all the plasticity to deal with our future climate scenario. So if we then look at the orange ones, they're the interesting ones. They're the ones on the edge of the range, and they're the ones that we're trying to understand by using observation data or by using trait-based information, how the ability those plants will have to adapt to our predicted future. So this work has moved on. So what we can see here, again, these are big plots in climate. So this is all on modelling. And what we can do, we can use cluster analysis of all those points, and then we can use a Euclidean distance calculation to work out the best suited ecosystem to select that species. So we can see here for Quercus roba, for instance, we're really moving to its outside edge. So for this species to have that genetic plasticity or that natural ability to adjust to our predicted future, we would have to seed source from places like in Hungary there, near Lake Bolton. So this is really what we're looking at here at Kew when we look at our future treescape, but also hopefully trying to build this into some urban context and give some high level advice to the commercial nurseries when they're thinking about sourcing material. Now, we've managed to progress this further, and we've created these maps. So this is really what we're using here at Kew when we start to look at our collections, but also when we start looking at our trips and our collection trips. So what we're doing now, we're really being detailed before we start to build a plant collection trip for our landscape and for conservation for the collections, that we use data like this. So this is a global map where we have used all these variables used in the model, and then we've managed to plot that globally to where that exists now. So in recent trips, you can see here it's highlighted in blue is Romania there in the steppe. So the European steppe is well suited. And we run a trip to Georgia last year, which is also highlighted on this map. But we've also got a team out at the moment in Kazakhstan, because that's also well suited to our future environment. And we're trying to build up a trip to Azerbaijan now, because that's also very well suited to our predicted future when we look at our growing conditions. So what we've been doing now is starting to build in tree traits. So by working with great individuals like Andy Hirons, we've been doing a lot of trait-based testing. Now, a lot of this testing has resulted in publications, and these are a few papers where we've used this methodology to then start looking at how we can look at drought and drought tolerance within species. So this is quite a known method by using the leaf turgelos point. So this is a lot of research that is well published, especially through TDAG with the tree selection guide. But what's interesting here, we can see from this, for Coleteria paniculata in particular, that with the results from the modelling, but also from these turgelos point results, we can see that obviously the more negative the number, the better the resilience for drought, and obviously Coleteria is the winner in this test. Now we do have Carpinus orientalis, which is just a bit under on the -3, but I do think that this was taken in the wetter year, and these are leaves and they change every year. So I do think if we was to test the leaves this year, we would see that increased tolerance to drought. Now, hot off the press, this is a paper that was accepted last week. So this one has just been published, and this is where we've really been looking to see if we can find a link between the modelling data and the functional traits. And in this paper, we really explored that, and we found a very good relationship between using this climatic moisture index and the modelling that we've been using and the results we have from functional traits. So we know that we can use models now to screen a large amount of trees, and we know that will allow us to focus on those trees that we need to focus on now. We can do this big screening of multiple species with the model with good confidence. So this is really starting to be used now, and this is a great test. So for the Greater London Authority, we are currently carrying out an assessment of all the public realm trees. So using both modelling, but also functional trait information. And this is really where we're moving to now. So this is just a sneak preview. We're still very much working on this. We're coming to the closing stages now, but this has been a great thing to do and a really good project. So what we've used here are various traits that we know show trees' ability to adapt to drought stress. So we use things like leaf dry matter content, wood density, but also turgid loss point of leaves, and we've used the climate as well. And what we've been doing is basically creating a composite score so we can really make good assessments of these trees to guide us on what trees are going to be, resilient, or what trees are going to be vulnerable as we move through. We've done a lot more work on this data set now, and me and Andy Hirons are pretty confident in the latest revision of this. We've got it pretty well suited now, and we're very confident in what we've managed to create. This has been a big project with lots of big data, and it's been really interesting to see how we could use these methodologies to really understand what trees we should be planting into the future, but also what the real consequence of climate change and urban heat islands on our urban trees. And that's a quick run through of what we've been doing. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much indeed, Kevin. Again, another fascinating talk. You've generated so many questions. So what I'm going to try and do is grab just one or two that kind of relate to methodology, and then we'll invite all of the speakers to come back on, put their cameras back on, and we'll trigger some more general debate for all of you. I think what was often coming up in the questions just now were around the urbanization type considerations in your methodology. So were you able to make any sort of consideration of urbanization and those pre-existing heat elements or drought elements when you were doing your assessment?
Yeah, so we're quite fortunate in that the modelling that we use is quite a refined scale, so it's at 1 kilometre square. And we have done a lot of checking the data where we can look at central London results and how those trees come out in their score compared to outside of London. And we are picking that up. So the urban heat and that intensity is being picked up. I think where it won't be so accurate is the difference between an urban park and in the grey, so in the footpath. We can't get that refinement in modelling. There's just not the data refinement there. But overall, we can start to understand the difference between the urban environment and also the countryside, so to speak. We've done lots of different tests. For me, I've done an assessment at Kew. I've also done our sister garden, Wakehurst, and there's a very big difference. Wakehurst isn't going to be as badly affected as Kew. So it is picking up those differences.
Fantastic. Another sort of dichotomies that have been coming out in the questions are around sort of the deciduous versus the evergreen. Have you got any trends that you can particularly sort of reflect on for us before we go to?
So Yeah, so what we're going to see with conifers, a lot of the conifers are going to be a lot more vulnerable. They're high alpine, they come from high humidity. Now, that is something that we have found now, is the humidity is what really does drive that water demand. So the drier the air, the less humidity, the more the plant needs water. And that's something we are seeing. So it is an understanding now of what evergreens we need to look at and how they're going to adapt. And that's a lot of the work that we're working on now.
Fantastic. So he's opened up new research areas, new questions for you as well. So that's really interesting. And last and not least, from the collective of questions that's come forward already, is around the question of native and non-native. And although that's a massive topic, let's just boil it down a minute and say to you, what's your feelings about the natives, how they're faring, and are there any particular strategies that you think really should be endorsed to protect some or any or all? Three massive questions there for you on. But...
Yeah, I was going to say, that's a lecture in itself. So, right, if we think of natives, we've got to stop thinking that natives only grow in the UK. Okay, our native tree species has a very big range. Okay, we need to think about that because taxonomically they're the same species. So, for instance, we know that small leaf lime and the common oak, I refuse to call it English oak, but common oak will grow all the way through Europe and it ends right out on that border of Georgia and Azerbaijan. Now, what we're looking at and what we've been doing in our collection trips is we've been bringing seed back of those species from these areas because we know through the modelling that they will have the better ability to adapt to our predicted future genetically because of interspecific variation within the species. So taxonomically, they're the same, but they're adjusting. So they have that genetic plasticity. So what we're looking at is essentially like, in an ecology term, is assisted migration. So we're collecting a lot of these native species from the edge of their range. We're growing them on here at Kew, so we can try to understand what trait they are adapting in order to live in a very different environment. And that's the work that we're doing. So I think the native, non-native thing, yeah, we can still use that species composition, but we have to understand that the seed sourcing will have to be from a different area and not the UK.
Fantastic. And therein begins another long conversation, doesn't it? So, but that's a great answer and very encouraging, I think, for many too, to hear your response there. So let's have everybody put their cameras back on for our speakers, please. And what I would really like to do now is encourage a conversation. I mean, there's been some great questions going in the chat. In fact, I have, in the last few minutes, managed not to keep up anymore. There's been that many. So I really encourage you, if you've got a question for one or more of our speakers, to put your camera on and come forward and share that. And perhaps to give you a few seconds to do that or reflect on it, I'm going to put a broad question out there to all of our speakers. Do seem to be, or certainly this year, seem to be very strong evidence that, it got hot and dry very quickly, didn't it? And then autumn seems to have come early as well. Is there a change in seasonality and how are you reflecting on that in your different areas of work, please? Should we go to Richard first, as you spoke first and ask for an answer, and then invite the others to reflect as well on seasonality?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'll probably let others who are probably more qualified on the direct answer on seasonality to come back. But I mean, I think, my look at the projections, I think the sort of, the dry springs and the risks of dry springs is, fully consistent with what we do expect on this. So I think it is kind of indicative of that. But I think actually probably on the it's that multi-year dryness, I think actually that's probably some of the most worrying things on our side, particularly thinking about the water supply issues and the consequences of having those multiple spring and summer dry periods stacked up in consecutive years without the ability therefore to replenish the sort of reservoirs and the water stocks. And we have sort of bounced between them over the recent years, but I think it's actually that risk of these sort of being chained together in consecutive years. It's probably actually some of the things that feels most worrying to me right now.
Very much. Thank you, Sue, for the prompt. Please, people, put your camera on. That will then bring you to the fore of the screen, and I'll know you're ready to ask a question. But while you're, if anybody's doing that, Oscar or Emma, Kevin, any thoughts on how you're reflecting on seasonality in your work? Oscar?
Yeah, well, for us, it's more about having a look at all the components of health, and so one of them is we don't want to lose the solar gain during winter in the built environment, because that actually contributes to maintaining temperature at a preferable level as well. So the urban heat island is negative during summer, but during winter it has actually a positive effect on our energy consumption and on the health of people, protecting them from cold-related health issues. So we typically encourage in urban climate sensitive designs to go more for deciduous trees, to basically have the sun still entering in your urban canyons when the trees lose their leaves in the winter and in autumn, and that's it. And then during summer, they grow them back, and you get all the benefits from the shading, etc., etc. So that would be how we would integrate seasonality in our case.
Interesting point. Thank you so much. Others?
Yeah, for me, massively. So the spring droughts are going to cause a lot of issues with trees as we move forward, especially when we start looking at our natives and things like oak, for instance. They don't like spring droughts. They've got large vessels. They're putting on sapwood, so they're going to be more vulnerable to cavitation, which is the main stress when we look at drought stress. Also, we're going to start seeing large amounts of rainfall in the autumn and winter, especially if we look at 22. That's going to be an issue, because that's going to start causing anaerobic soil conditions if we're having floods, and the trees aren't obviously absorbing water then, so it's going to sit in the soil and cause root death. So really for us here now in the southeast, this is going to become more of an issue, this seasonality, and the dry springs really are a concern for us growing trees, because this year has been particularly bad. So if this is going to become a common trend, which it looks like it's going to be, I think we really do have to think about how we start to establish trees and support them through that stressful period.
Yeah, and I think that goes then straight into Emma making a response as well, especially around getting your communities involved. You talked about Birmingham Tree People and getting communities involved in planting. So have you seen any change in action there, Emma?
It's like you read my mind, Kieron. I think the point I was going to mention was I think Dee is best placed to correct me if I remember this wrong, but Birmingham Tree People pay people to go out and water trees in June, July, and August. And I think Barcham say you need to give a tree 2 buckets, is it, every other day, something like that. So it's a huge amount of water that needs to go out to new trees. But because we start watering in June, it had already been dry for a month, and some of the new trees were already starting to look sad and droopy. So it's really important to understand what these changes are, what these changes mean for trees, and then what these changes mean for tree maintenance. And just to pick up the swings between wet and dry are projected to become more frequent in the future.
Lots of talk here, isn't there, about strategic infrastructure and, having water holding, when it is wet and hanging onto it when it's dry, and even around this soil preparation idea, so that, we don't get those anaerobic conditions that that Kevin was talking about. So extra thinking at all these levels because of the implications of what we've been learning about today and talking about. Emily, you've got your hand up. I'm hoping you're going to ask a question, because I don't want to be the only one asking a question. Brilliant.
Yes, hi.
Thank you.
Emily Bond from Natural England. I was just going to add a little bit more to the question I did ask. I'm sorry, I'm the one that started the big chat in the chat box. But to Kevin, I mean, what kind of considerations are taken into account when choosing these plant species for the other ecosystem services that they provide, and the sustenance that they provide to other species and invertebrates and things like that are also going to be struggling?
Yeah, that's a great conversation. That's work that we're currently undertaking. So I'm doing the modelling stuff and the potential impact of trees, but we're working with the Botanic Gardens of Edinburgh as well, with some of their entomologists, and we're trying to understand that. So we've just got some funding. So this is work being led by Andy Hirons, and we're trying to look at the potential loss and gains of biodiversity. So looking at flowering, nectar,
Yeah.
also insect life on both our native species, but also on our non-native species. So that is something we're looking into, but it's still very early days.
Yeah, well, that's the crossover that I'm concerned about, really, because I mean, you've got all these wonderful. I mean, I like the way that you explained how you can get the stock from elsewhere that has already become hardy to some of these changes in climate. So that's very encouraging. Thank you.
Please keep those hands going up and questions coming. While we're waiting, let's pick up this question around differences in urban areas and urban morphology. We know that not all urban areas are the same, and this urban design, well, if the place already exists, perhaps it's not that easy to change the urban design. But do we need to think about this with respect to tree species selection, and what other considerations should there be? Who wants to take that first? Oscar.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump on that. I think there is no perfect solution, and eventually I think there's no perfect solution, and eventually the real job is about making sure that the evidence at the local level is given, so that locally tailored solution can be discussed, and actually discussed not only at the level of the decision makers, but also with the people who live in those environments. There was a question in the chat about the optimal density of a city, for example. Yeah. There's no given answer to this. When it comes to energy, typically you want to densify. When it comes to greening your city, well, you got to make space. There's only that much space you can get in 3 dimension, and also the evidence on the actual effectiveness of the vertical vegetation in an urban area is quite debated and debatable. So that is a paradox. We know that the denser the city, the greater the risk of air pollution. Now that is changing because of the new transports that rely mostly on electrification of cars, for example, etc. But we know also that the energy consumption is greater the more the sprawl there is. I mean, I don't think there is a perfect solution there. There is now evidence that the more open the city, the less heat-related mortality there is, so which is to be expected. So yeah, I mean.
Yeah, no, great. And clearly the question on the impact around pests and diseases and climate would influence selection, but we know there's always a strong need to think about the local conditions, the planting conditions, the local environment, the built environment when picking choosing a species to plant. So, but Kevin, have you got any reflections on the different types of urban morphology and species selection?
Yeah,
thanks, Oscar, for jumping in first.
I do think we have to think about this carefully, and from some of the work that we've done, there's going to be it's very different for each city or town. So even when we use modeling data and we can use these predictions, we will see a big difference, for instance, between London and Glasgow. They're all going to have different amounts of precipitation, and we got to come away from a one rule fits all, and it's going to be very site specific, and especially when we think about species composition. We can then, it's going to have to be really site specific on how we build these species compositions into achieve good green infrastructure. And we're only talking about trees. We're forgetting about shrubs. Woody shrubs are going to become more important as we try to get more green infrastructure in, and that's something we can't forget about. We need to start thinking about that next layer down and how we plant shrubs and trees together to create good green infrastructure, but it's going to be very site specific. And I think that's going to be our biggest challenge culturally, both in design and from the public, and what they believe is good planting now, because it's going to really have to change as we move to the future.
Thanks, Kieron. And thinking there around, the mix and the dynamicness of species composition across the town or city is clearly going to be impacted. Janie, I see your hand. I'm going to come right to you, but Oscar put his hand up as well. And I just wondered if you wanted to add to this response first, Oscar, before we go to Janie.
Yeah, just to compliment there. This is a personal opinion, but I think often in urban climate sensitive design, there's this kind of tendency to plant new trees or like refurbish everything in the urban area and not really care that much about existing trees, long lasting trees. I don't know what Kevin has to say about that, if it's actually relates to you, but definitely we know that the benefits that are brought by those trees when it comes to whether air pollution or actually cooling capacity are much greater the older the tree is and the larger the leaf area indexes as well. So there's also this dimension to think about. Yeah, just wanted to comment upon this.
Yeah, no, the established trees are going to be so important as we move forward. But we've also got to think about, when we think of ecosystem services, especially for cooling, if that species isn't well suited to grow within that environment and it goes into a stress strategy, you're not getting that ecosystem service benefit of cooling. So we have to be mindful. So we will see certain trees will have to be added into the system that are better adapted so they can provide that ecosystem service, because we know as trees go into stress, they're locking down their cells, they're not doing the transrespiration, so therefore they can cause issues, increasing heat because they're only providing shade. So there's lots to think about.
It's opening up another avenue of conversation here, isn't it? Because we're talking about heat and the cooling benefit of trees, but trees can provide so many benefits. Let me just ask Janie, was it a new question or is it on this topic? It's a new question. Okay, so Emma, did you want to add to this topic while we're on this focus?
I just wondered if Henry might want to, because I saw he had his hand up, his physical hand, and I wasn't sure if you'd spotted that. So I'm raising my hand for somebody else.
Henry, did you want to jump in, add to this conversation? You're on mute. You seem to be talking to me, but you're on mute. No, that's it. Try again. And now we still can't hear you. You're off mute. Maybe pop your answer in the chat for us. I don't want to let you miss out. Okay, let's jump over to Janie then. Maybe we'll start a new line of conversation while we're Janie.
Yeah, it's Janie, but never mind.
Sorry, thank you.
Yes, I wanted, this has been really interesting, but one area, I mean, we're talking about, it's all been rather neutral in terms of planning. And many of us, possibly on this call, have had long struggles with planning departments to save trees, and that's been with pressure from insurance companies, with pressure from the developers, and so it goes from the microcosm of trying, literally fighting for 5 years to save 3 mature trees, to much larger issues about green space in towns, and so it's not a given. I mean, it's wonderful to see what's going on in Birmingham and other places, but it's not a given that our planning departments understand the issues that are being raised here, and I just wonder whether the speakers here, have they had to deal in any way with actually being in an adversarial position with the city, governance.
Thanks very much, Janie. And it was mentioned earlier, wasn't it, about more intergovernmental department interaction and how challenging that could be. But yeah, let's put your question to the speakers. Anybody been in that position, especially in an adversarial way? Oscar's hand went up first, yeah?
Yeah, Jenny. So I'm leaving my UCL hat here and I'm putting the citizen hat, just for the record. I did do that in Brussels in the past. It's a very complicated task. I think as long as there's no true communication between research and decision makers on the benefits, which Kevin just pointed out before, of those old trees, it's very difficult to convince them. For us, it was always a security argument that was presented. We tried preserving old oak and plane trees on a square that was to be refurbished, and it was always argued that it didn't matter because anyway they were replanting trees and they were actually increasing the surface of the green area, but we knew that the benefits would not be basically given before X amount of decades. And it's an obscure, it was a bit of an obscure system. You got an insurance company that comes, does an assessment, you don't really know on what ground, and then it's said to be insecure, and that's it. So I'm happy if you want to have a chat about it, to have a chat about that later, but I don't think it's the job of us as researchers to necessarily take part in this, because it's beyond our capacities. It's very locally tailored anyway. I think it's best that we manage to influence a larger public by basically making them aware of those benefits in the first instance, so that there is actually a true discussion that is engaged before action is taken. Yeah.
Thank you. Richard.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing to add here is, one of the things that our committee's always been really, really strong at wanting us to look at as part of doing our assessments is the sort of, the MPPF, the national planning frameworks, really, and what sort of guidance that produces down. And I think that's one area where I think we do think there is just, not quite the right set of incentives in place to sort of really be specific around what considering resilience means within the planning framework, and a lot of it is left to interpretations, a bit vague. Plans that exist, even things like the Thames Estuary 2100 plan is a sort of non-statutory plan, so the ability for these things to have weight. So some recent developments that we thought were relatively positive, but I think there's still a long way to go on having a planning policy framework that really lines in behind this kind of thing that the question was asking about.
Thank you. And that connectivity of key priorities across policies that come out, whether it's greening or resilience, they're obviously related, but if they're not explicitly mentioned, then they easily can get forgotten. I mean, Emma was particularly talking about all the different policy documents and layers that are underpinned by research and data coming through actually to action on the ground. But you also, I think somebody, was it yourself, Richard, talked about if all of the areas, might be an Oscar actually, if all of the areas were taken up with green, this is the impact we'll get. But Emma, you came off. Can you respond a bit more to the policy into action sort of side of things?
So it's interesting because Richard was saying, if we make the NPP, and how many P's has it got? NPPF stronger, then that helps mandate action at local level. But then, is it a top-down approach that we need in our urban areas? And I was thinking, the West Midlands Combined Authority, I think I wonder if there's sort of a regional level for planning, and I wonder if that's the opportunity for adaptation and resilience and planning. It's to decentralize it a little bit and make the local actors stronger so that we can get these things through the planning system. The Green Infrastructure Plan I showed for Birmingham, it won't be mandated. I'm not a planner, so I forget what level of planning document it is. It's a guide of how they want the area to develop. And then we see what happens. And then, of course, there's enforcement, because even if something is designed well and it goes into the ground, then even if something is designed well, it doesn't necessarily go into the ground at the specification it was designed.
Yeah, that's so often the way, isn't it? But I mean, I suppose, but even leading from the bottom, getting the trees in the ground, leading through that action, actually having those that vision that you've got and shared, and having the ability to deliver some of that does lead to that change that we're after and looking for. nobody else put their hand up recently, but there were a couple other questions that
Who
came
has a
up.
hand up, Kieron?
I can't make my yellow hand go up, Kieron, so I'm just waving.
Oh, I
Sorry.
can't see you, Steve. So good.
That's all
So
right. No,
jumping.
I'm on my emergency power, so it's going off and on all over the place. But I think all this leads to a tremendous reason why all local authorities should have, adopted tree strategies. I mean, that would be a good starting point. I mean, the MPPF and the Town Country Planning Act are all sort of supportive of trees, but that's a long way from actually getting trees. But adopted tree strategies, clarity about what's required. And perhaps if in this country we actually did have an effective, comprehensive land use framework, all sorts of things would start fitting into place better. Oh, we've got a planner. Speaking as a planner,
I was going to say,
Collins.
Sarah, do you want to jump on and talk us through your comment then, speaking as a planner? Can we encourage you to do that?
Hi there. Oops, sorry.
Hi.
So I work for West Lothian Council, but I've been working for many decades and also worked in the north of England. And as you can hear from my accent, I grew up in Western Canada in a forest, in a house in a forest. But I've been working for so long that I've seen the huge reduction in planning facilities. I mean, resources. I mean, there used to be resources for new towns and, docklands repair and all. And we're really just doing, I mean, in a regular local planning department, we're doing statutory stuff. And it's really, I struggle with my colleagues who are doing applications, but they have more and more placed on them. And I mean, literally just getting the funds. We're one of the fastest growing authorities to the west of Edinburgh, for new school places is tough. But I am writing a resilient woodland and forest strategy. I've got doing an event next week, like for stakeholders. And yeah, there's lots of small projects and lots of small tweaks. And I'm trying to make a strategy that kind of has signposts in it so that, all the different stakeholders, the different estates, the different people, giving advice, not just high level strategic stuff, lots of photos. And hopefully that will help, support that. But we're quite suburban. Hope that answers what you were wanting to hear.
Well, again, you're talking about working at the different layers and drawing upon the different layers, but still delivering or acting locally. So I think it adds to it, and I hope across the broad audience that we have, people are benefiting from that. So thanks for jumping on. Kev, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, it'd be interesting when we look in a decade's time, the influence of what biodiversity net gain is going to have when we look at these developments, because that's going to be the focus on that. And it'd be interesting to see how that will affect tree planting strategies, both at local and national level as we move forward, and how developers are going to look at hopefully using it positively and not try and use it as a loophole to get out of things. But I think that's where we need to start looking as well, is trying to influence when these projects go through, is having experts look at these plans for biodiversity net gain. And I do think as an industry, I think that's where a lot of our expertise will come into play as we move forward.
Yeah, but if it wasn't for all the topics and the data and the research that we mentioned today, they couldn't be considered in the planning as we move forward, and the thinking and the species selection and making the right choices now for the future. So that's great. Thanks, Kevin. Emily, your hand went up.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that I do actually work in planning for Natural England, and there is a massive problem with biodiversity net gain implementation on site or nearby to the sites that are funding it. So in places like Birmingham, you've got them having to send this biodiversity net gain incentives all the way to Malvern in Worcestershire. So, because of it being an urban environment, the space for these things to be put in is very limited. So again, it's the right planting in the right place at the right time and connecting people as well with the nature that you're putting in. It's all very, very tricky. And we now have gone on to high opportunity and high risk casework. So we're not getting to see the smaller things that would have such a large impact to communities in inner cities. It's all about development plans and local plans and influencing at that level.
Right. Thank you. That's really helpful. Just reflecting across the board of some of the things we've been talking about today. Canopy cover is one of the first steps documents that's just been released by TDAG, a second one in the series on canopy cover. Emma talked about Birmingham having a 20% canopy cover. Somebody asked Oscar the question of just how much canopy cover is needed to maintain cooling. We've talked about species selection and retaining mature trees, because they have the stature and they hold the canopy cover in place of what we already have. Because if you put a little tree in there, it takes a long time still to add to the canopy cover. There is the 330-300 rule, which is a guide to recommend we get 30% canopy cover across our urban areas for the benefit of people. There is the EU nature restoration law that is a minimum 10% canopy cover, but also has higher levels of expectation. I just wonder what the speakers' opinions were on canopy cover targets and holding those, or even getting to those, because it is. We also touched upon today about key performance indicators and how we actually talk about delivery and set ourselves a way of measuring achieving that. So if we can take those in turn and see if maybe canopy cover is a bit of a way of consolidating some of our thinking today, as well as the other things that TDAG is actively engaging in.
I'll go first.
Well done, Kevin.
Oscar's
okay.
going.
No, go on,
Just
Kevin. Emma,
No,
you were both jumping in. That's fine. I can come later. Yeah.
I was just, when we think about canopy cover, anything that gets us away from just tree planting targets and get us to tree establishment will be a positive. So it doesn't matter what KPI we use, as long as we get these trees to establish and not just planting them. And I think that's where we're really struggling now. Like, there's always funding to plant trees, but we all know the difficulties in getting the funding to establishment. And that establishment is what's important. So it doesn't matter what KPI we use, as long as it's about tree establishment and not planting, it's got to be a benefit.
Here. Thank you. And that'll mean we need good species selection. It means we think about the seasonality change. It means we think about so many of the things we've talked about today. I'm going to go to Oscar and then Emma, because Emma, you've talked about your 20% and previously about the struggles of Birmingham to hit a higher target. So I'm keen to hear from you as well. But Oscar?
I don't have any major opinion on the targets that are set. I think having them is always good. They are often quite, I just wanted to say, and I don't know if some of you were at the International Conference on Urban Climate in Rotterdam this July. There was a keynote speaker, Edward Enge, who worked in Hong Kong, and who has been actually quite influential in setting the targets of tree planting in Hong Kong. And he gave a very nice story of how that was actually quite randomly decided, simply based on the fact that decision makers and politicians were expecting to be re-elected. And he asked to have 40%, and the person who was in the run said, no, it's not possible, 20%. And he said, no, for 3. And then they came down to 30%. And this is how it was decided. So targets are fine, but they don't necessarily mean something that is scientifically backed up. The real question you have to ask yourself, in my opinion, is why wouldn't you plant a tree in the first place? Or why wouldn't you keep the vegetation that is existing? And then if you have proper arguments against it, then yes.
Yeah, and there is literature out there supporting 20%, 30% and 40%, of course. So thanks, Oscar. Really good summary there. Emma? Maybe the closing word from yourself before we wrap up.
I'm going to say 3 quick things.
Yes.
So I think I gave one measure of canopy cover. I think we've measured it 3 times and we've got 3 different numbers. So, I mean, what is canopy cover anyway? I think canopy cover is really important for shade and for keeping people cool, and also for keeping people dry. I have a big tree outside my house and people are always stood underneath it for some reason or the other. And last but not least, when a big tree comes down, and it's had this huge big canopy cover. I think, when was it planted? It must have been planted 100 years ago, before any of this madness happened. And are we going to have trees like that in the future?
You've done it brilliantly for me, wrapping up, Emma. I just want to say thank you very much again to all of our speakers for your fabulous talks and conversations, to our audience for the questions and your participation, to TDAG for inviting me to have the opportunity to be a part of this as well today. Really enjoyed it. Just to let you know that Forest Research does have a climate change hub. We have several fact sheets on there that might be of interest to you, that support and provide information on a range of these topics today. So I'll add that to the talk as I pass over to Sue to wrap up today's seminar session. Thanks again, everyone. It's been great fun.
A big thank you to Kieron as well for doing such an admirable chairing job. So our next seminar is on the 8th of October, and it's on education, how education in schools can encourage resilience in urban treescapes. Please put the link in the chat, and we will be circulating details with when we send out an email on all this. And you'll have gathered that this year's sessions have all been focused on resilience. So Emma and Dee and I will sit down with wet towels around our heads shortly and think what we might talk about in 2026. So if you have any suggestions of topics that you would think we should raise, or indeed you would also like to take part in, can you let us know? I think that's the end of this meeting. If I'll stay online, Emma and Dee and I'll stay online for a few minutes in case anybody's got any other sort of more TDAG related business they'd like to raise with us. Otherwise, I'll just thank you all for coming, all the speakers, Kieron for chairing, and look forward to seeing you another time. Thanks.